Looks like we're good. So yes, can you state your name and affiliation for the recording?
Deborah Lafer, and I'm Professor of Urban Informatics at the Center for Urban Science and Progress and in the Department of Civil and Urban Engineering at New York University.
Thank you. And so I sent you this consent form before, but I'll read through it now, and then we'll do oral consent on the recording. So you are invited to participate in a research study about disaster research perspectives on COVID-19 led by Liesl Ritchie at Oklahoma State University. The protocols have been approved from the Institutional Review Board at OSU as well as at the University of Kansas. Your participation in this research is voluntary. There's no penalty for refusal, and you can opt out and withdraw your consent at any time. If you agree to be in this study, we do ask that you do the following: participate in this Zoom interview that should take about 1 hour. And then also we ask that you'll participate in one subsequent interview in about 12 months following up on your initial comments. There's no compensation for participating in the study, and unless you request otherwise, the information you give in the study will not be anonymous. So this means that your comments will be attributed to you, but we believe that your participation in the study with that confidentiality level involves risk similar to a researcher's daily activities. And so with that, do you agree to participate in this research?
I do agree.
Thank you. All right, so we can get started, and so I'll just go through these question prompts that I think you were able to take a look at before. And so the first one is just to start, would you please tell me a bit about your professional background?
So I have a bit of a mixed background. So I started in art history with a Bachelor's of Arts from Columbia University, and then stayed on and took a Bachelor's of Science in Bachelor's of Science in Civil Engineering, also at Columbia University. I then worked in the construction industry and took my master's at night in civil at what was then Brooklyn Polytech, and is now part of NYU Tandon. During that, I focused mostly on geotechnics. I spent then a year overseas at the University, the Politecnico di Milano, taking some of the techniques I learned on ground improvement and applying them to masonry walls for seismic retrofit. I then returned to the United States and attended the University of Illinois on an NSF fellowship and got my PhD in geotechnics under Ed Cording, and while I was there, I also earned a master's degree in structural engineering.
Very nice, thank you. When and how did you get involved with research on disasters?
So that was starting while I was in graduate school. I was very interested in unreinforced masonry and how it's often damaged because it ties to a lot of historic buildings. And although I don't think I had a strong interest in earthquakes, so to speak, it seemed that the only people in the United States who were really looking at unreinforced masonry were doing it in an earthquake context. So I started getting quite involved with EERI and ended up being the student chapter president there, and we ran a nice one-day seminar for about 75 researchers in the region, and then published some proceedings and did some other stuff. And so I started getting involved with the ERI and eventually helped them restart a heritage and existing structures committee for them, I think in 2006. Maybe it was earlier, I don't remember. Anyway, so that was really kind of my start of it. I also, through that, started getting involved with the kind of state level offices of emergency management, particularly at that time through the state of Illinois, and we ran a training project for 265 architects, engineers, architecture students, engineering students to teach them how to be post-earthquake inspectors. So this was ATC 20 plus some additional material, with the idea that should the New Madrid fault really go, that most of the engineers in the community would be very busy servicing their own clients and would not be available, and taking care of their own families, and so would not be available for rapid building inspection. One of the things that I think most influenced me as part of that was a comment made by the emergency management manager that I was working with at the time, and he said, you know, when Northridge happened, there was 3 inches of snow on the ground in Illinois. So the solution of putting all these people who were displaced out in tents outside was not a possibility. And given that Illinois had most of their public assembly buildings were also of unreinforced masonry, so churches, gyms, schools, it seemed that this was really a critical thing for us to help the state do. And it also made me think a bit more broadly about how disasters in one community can be very different and have secondary and tertiary implications than maybe the standard way we think about them.
Absolutely. Do you consider yourself to have to like specialize in a certain type of disaster research? So, for example, earthquake engineering?
No, I would say I have not, because I'm coming from it more from a building failure approach. You know, I'm building fail from lots of things. I'm looking at really more from a resiliency. Mm-hmm. And so I've done some work on the flood side and some work on the earthquake side, but, you know, a lot more general stuff. We did a workshop, an NSF workshop in 2004, where we just brought together lots of people from the disaster community and talked about what their joint needs were. Mm-hmm. I also did some work for the Ford Foundation early on, and was considering, you know, what about things like malicious activities and so man-made intentional disasters and bombings and things like that.
I can pause the recording if you need to.
It's all right. No, it's fine. So.
Well, thanks. Is there one seminal disaster event that really shaped your thinking about disaster research? You talked about.
Yeah, it, you know, so about Northridge and this implication of what if Northridge happened in central Illinois on the day that it happened.
Yeah.
I think the other one that really influenced my thinking was the response activities after 9/11 and the use of aerial remote sensing.
Let me ask you, when you were in central Illinois and you talked to that emergency manager who made the comment about Northridge, Northridge was 1994. What year was this in central Illinois?
Probably 97 we had that conversation.
Okay.
And so after 9/11, they used aerial LiDAR to help with the debris removal and the larger kind of rebuilding and response side. And I was very fortunate, and I had an opportunity to meet Dave Bloomquist at the University of Florida, who was actually a faculty member there who flew the plane for NOAA doing that. And he was very generous and shared with me some resources. And from that, I really started getting involved with remote sensing and how to apply remote sensing to these more district level or city scale issues in civil engineering.
Fascinating. That is really interesting. With NERI, just following up from earlier, there's another facility, the RAPID facility, that you're familiar with it.
Yeah.
Okay. And so that, I think that kind of covers a lot about your background leading into, say, 2020. What was the focus of your research before COVID-19? So say before mid-March, were you
Yeah.
engaged in a particular study?
So most of my work has been using remote sensing in support of civil infrastructure projects. Thinking about how can we use them to build better flood models? How can we use them to build better models to communicate flood risk to people? How do we basically auto-generate city-scale models for computational modeling in a way that's meaningful to the engineering community? So there's been a lot of cool models for Hollywood, for gaming, but they don't include either the features we as engineers need, or they're in a way that I was describing them as immutable, and therefore they have very limited functionality.
Mm-hmm.
So most of my work the last 15 years has really been about how do we do a better job harnessing these data sets to collect the information that the civil engineering community needs, particularly things like getting facade data from aerial imagery and laser scanning, whereas most of the work had really been done just looking downwards, nadir. And then how do you operationalize that data in a way that goes into traditional workflows that are recognizable by the engineering community, whether that's finite element or it's computational fluid dynamics or whatever it is. So.
Was there a particular project that you had going, or maybe still have going, but in mid-March, right before the pandemic?
I mean, we have the Urban Arc project, which is a NSF-funded project. It's funded through the National Science Foundation and then co-funded through Science Foundation Ireland and the Northern Ireland Trust to be a tripartite flood study, looking at New York, Dublin, and Belfast.
Okay. And then did COVID-19 impact that research study?
It definitely did. We were just on the eve of hosting a major workshop to have our foreign partners meet a large number of city agency people here in New York. And so it was scheduled for March the 20th, and on March the 6th, I told my partners that I really felt that we needed to consider canceling this. Or actually, it was probably before. It was about March 6th was a Monday, so we had our meeting on the 3rd, and I announced to everyone that I really thought we needed to cancel, and with a lot of reluctance, we agreed on it. And about 5 days later, the university actually forbade all that stuff. So. And then we had, obviously, the pause order starting the 3rd of March. So.
Have you tried to do a virtual event to make up for that, or?
We are discussing it, but a lot of my partners and myself have not been permitted to go back into the universities. So while my group can do most of our work virtually, although a little bit more difficulty, it's been harder for our partners. And even our partner in Belfast, they were actually not permitted to let their students do field work. We continued to be permitted to do that, and we have, with certain precautions, obviously. But and that has held up the project. We continue to engage with our civic partners and are trying to devise something for a virtual workshop in October, but it's definitely not the same, because the idea was you put on a VR headset and then you could see your own place of work, place of residence under the flooding. And so we've had to change the technology. We couldn't do any of the data collection we anticipated. And we were just to the point of being able to launch something, although we don't think it is as good, but something at least in the direction that we wanted to go, that people will be able to access online from their homes.
Okay, I'll have some follow-up questions on that. the reason that, you're part of our sample for this interview process is that you had some COVID-19 specific research going on, say, since then. And what is the focus of that research?
The idea was to understand how people interact with the built environment. So there was a lot of concern that people going into subways and other public transportation were touching things, and that other people were touching them, getting them sick. Nobody knows this for sure. And so we started thinking about what is this concept of touch. I had done a little bit of work previously and given a talk at DEF CON in 2018 on what would the Spanish flu look like in 2018, So it was a little too prescient, and talked about, well, this is how it spread, and this is how fast it spread, and what would that look like today, and things like Legionnaire's disease, and coming through vents and stuff like this, and how we need to start thinking about epidemiology in a 3D context, not just a 2D context. Little did I know this was all going to be so relevant. So the project itself had two components. One is to go down into subways and to actually video people touching things, trying to understand what they touched, how did they touch it, how long did they touch it. It quickly became evident that was actually too dangerous for our students to do. So we put all of the resources into the other study, which was to look at what people did when they came out of medical facilities, urgent cares and hospitals across New York City. We had about 16 facilities that we collected a significant amount of data from, about 6,100 subjects that we followed. Basically, the student observers would stand across the street from these facilities and randomly pick the next person who came out the door, and they would just watch what they did and where they went, what they touched, how many times they touched things. Did they then go into the subway? Did they go into a coffee shop? Did they get into an Uber? Did they touch their face? Did they, and to try to understand, with the assumption that everyone who's coming out is either themselves ill or is a carrier or has it physically on them.
Mm-hmm.
And there's certainly been a lot of studies coming out of China in particular showing that the personal objects of medical staff are completely contaminated. So we thought this would be a nice and interesting way to start thinking about this 3D environment in a different way.
How long would the students follow people after they left?
Up to 20 minutes or up to 1 mile, or until they could not see them any further. And this was like the world's most insane piece of research. So we got the call for the COVID rapids on a Thursday. I submitted my idea on Friday. I didn't know where to submit to. I got contacted back by Monday. I submitted something slightly more formal to the program director. He then asked for a 2-page. So I think that was a Thursday. And basically within about 14 days, we had funding and we had done the IRB and all of that. And now we were trying to push the university to let us hire, because there was a lot of confusion. Could you even hire students? We were on the eve of the pause order in New York City. We had no idea if students were even going to be allowed to, anybody was going to be allowed to be on the street. We had no idea what kind of, how strict things were going to be. So it was just this crazy thing. So we posted this basically ad. I added one extra component that the students had to do, because the feeling was that if you couldn't get people to follow directions, it was going to be impossible to get them to do what we want. So anybody who basically responded to the ad and did the extra thing that I asked, which was simply just to mail me their CV on top of applying formally, I interviewed if they lived in a zip code that we did not yet have a student, they got hired. And they were just hired on a rolling basis, and we just pushed them out into the field, basically even before they were hired. We were basically just saying, okay, go out there.
Okay.
and it was just insane. This is like all the things you wouldn't do normally, where you, for a rapid, you would have people who are trained, you would follow existing procedures, you would know exactly what equipment you were going to use. We had none of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then Tom and I had never worked together before. I mean, I knew him casually through my center, and I liked some of the work he did, and I thought it fit in well with this, because he would follow people and look what they were seeing and see if it impacted their smoking behavior. So I knew that he was kind of a good partner for this, and he had a good theoretical grounding for a lot of that work. He's as you know, in the School of Global Public Health. So we sent all these students out, and little did I know, but I actually had COVID at that point, and I was really sick. And I knew I was sick, but I think I didn't realize how sick I was. Luckily, it was just the fever and the exhaustion. I never ended up with any of the breathing problems, which is also why I wasn't sure I had it. Mm-hmm. But it was very challenging trying to deploy these students, answer their questions. There were things that came up that we didn't expect, of course, and deal with my own family issues with my kids having to go to online school, and was there food in the house, and all these things. So very, very difficult. So.
What kind of, I guess, month, and I don't know how long you were?
Our first student was deployed on March the 22nd, and we collected data through the 19th of May. Students collected as they could. Again, it was all done on this very ad hoc basis, that they had classes, sometimes the weather was too inclement, they had other obligations, so basically we asked them to put in 10 to 20 hours a piece for each of the weeks that they were going to work. And some of them consistently put in 20 hours and put in consistent days. Some of them would work 1 or 2 days with a lot of hours, whereas others would go out to the site, maybe 2 hours a day. So it was very choppy, in terms of the data, which of course has made the data very challenging to clean, to standardize. I mean, they weren't even using the same equipment and the same software to record the stuff. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we thought was going to work was actually advertised in a way that it didn't quite work the way the company said. And then we were stuck that the files could not be exported in a way that was useful for us. So we actually had to work with the company to get them to change their software development schedule, to bump this to the top, and to then work with Apple to get it released, because it's all as an app. So it was just this insane project. But in the end, the students logged 1,500 hours of data recording and related activities, and we ended up with over 5,000 records.
Wow.
Yeah. So we have spent the last 2.5 months cleaning the data, and are trying to get it out to the public in the next week to 2 weeks. So.
Wow. Okay, let me follow up with a couple of things. You kind of covered a lot of ground, so I'm going to kind of touch on several of those as we continue. And so just really taking a step for a second, what are the goals of this study? How do you expect your findings to be used?
Yeah, the goal of the study was to really understand what people's behavior was. And ideally, we thought we'd get out there before people got too aware of things. Like when I applied for the funding, it was way before anybody was talking about pause order. And so the idea was, okay, can we identify people's behavior and then see if it changes? But by the time we got the funding, we were already in the midst of things. So that didn't work out so well. But it was interesting to see, are people still touching lots of things, even though this is considered high-risk behavior? And what are they touching? And how are they doing it? And where are they going? And, some of these facilities we were in just neighborhoods that were just so impacted. So the idea was to try to understand what that behavior was. Did we consider it risky? Ultimately, we hope that people will take some of the things that we discover and try to implement policies that decrease that type of behavior. So, for instance, one of the facilities we looked at, especially for the first few weeks, every person who came out the door that we were monitoring had to touch the door. It was not an automated door. Mm-hmm. Some places we monitored had automatic doors and people still touched the doors. There was a lot of, I think there still is a lot of lack of clarity about people exiting these facilities wearing PPE, where they were clearly medical staff. Should they be wearing this stuff outside? Should they then be touching things in the environment and then wearing it back in? We saw a person who was smoking and they dropped the cigarette butt, and then a homeless person came and picked it up. We don't think about that as a transmission vector, but it was something we clearly saw. Obviously, there's been quite a few studies about public ridership of public transportation and how that's changed. Well, did that change at these medical facilities? Were they the exception? What we found that so far is that in communities, disadvantaged communities, that behavior changed less, right? Because people don't have other options. So they have to take the bus or the subway. They can't afford an Uber and they don't have a private car. There are also communities that are less clearly financially disadvantaged, but were very heavily hit. So trying to understand maybe some of the demographics that went into that. So one of the things we did was we tied all of our sites by zip code to the CDC Vulnerability Index and a batch of other demographic information, including things like what was the average commute time. Because obviously, anecdotally, and some initial studies clearly show links with poverty and household size and things like that with higher infection rates. But, so if you can identify that people are either touching things a lot and it's something that you can clean, or you can put up a sign saying, please don't touch things coming out, or remember you've been in a high-risk facility, please, behave as such. I think a lot of people come out of these facilities and, they're very upset. They're thinking about themselves and their own families and the stress that they're under, and they don't think necessarily about their behavior towards others. And there's definitely been cases where bus drivers have been infected by passengers, where Uber drivers have been infected by passengers, these kind of things. We also saw a huge number of people going back into the facility. They go out and they come back in, which is something we didn't think about. Minimum of 16%. And we, as I said, we stopped tracking people once they went to a bodega or wherever. Many of those people probably came back in as well. And so you've got people going out and coming in and out and coming in. And what does that mean from a risk point of view? Mm-hmm. So.
Are there any particular concepts or theories that are guiding this research project? And you mentioned that you gave that talk in 2018 on what if the Spanish flu happened today. And then you talked about how Tom had previous work following people and looking at what they would see. So is any of this that you're doing in your research kind of adapted from some prior work?
Yeah, I think Tom's probably better to speak about this. I think human agent vector something have, and it's about how things get transmitted. Mm-hmm. I would say that, I was more interested in trying to understand and to ultimately be able to show some of this stuff in 3D. So one of the things we did was, that was not funded on this grant that we found external funding for, was we took a laser scanner and we went out to 14 of these facilities and we just scanned the areas where basically we put the scanner where the student was standing, scanned that, and then scanned the areas to kind of the likely paths that people went. And the idea is to ultimately try to take some of this data and to be able to show people in 3D what it was like coming out of their facility, where were people touching, what were they touching, these kind of things.
Fascinating. You talked about the students, recording movements. That sounds like the primary method for the data collection. And you talked about using an app and working with Apple to change their production schedule. But were they recording video or were they Can you talk more about what they were recording?
Because we needed an immediate IRB. You may or not be aware that NSF will not actually release the funds unless the IRB has been approved. So we needed to get through the IRB process very, very fast. And you have to understand that, again, the university had just gone to all remote stuff. So everybody was really sure how to do things even. And also we wanted to make sure our students did not end up in some type of confrontational situation. So we made the decision that there would be no video recording, no audio recording. We basically had them download a mapping program, and they simply wrote the time that they started following somebody, whether they thought they were male or female, if they were by themselves or with others, and so how many others, and to simply track their path along this map, and then to mark anything time they saw them touch something and note what they touched, and then their end destination.
Okay. And have you applied that method in any prior research before? No, it was quite adapted to. Let's see, I've got some prompts and I'm just reading through them because I think you've kind of answered them, like what sort of adjustments did you have to make to accommodate?
Well, and the other thing was, usually if you're going to start a group of researchers, and whether it's a rapid or, anything, like there's always like a kickoff.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You go through safety protocols, nothing. We couldn't do anything. So the first thing we had was, I think about 7 days after we started the project, Tom and I got a big Zoom chat, and we just tried to go over things with people the best we could to remind them not to talk to people, not, to stand away, that, should they buy PPE, that we would reimburse them. But, and then as each student started, I had them send me the records from the first day to try to make sure that they were doing it right. But I don't know, some of them then basically went and changed the protocol, and it was just impossible to stay up on top of every record that was coming in.
Yeah.
The students were only supposed to track people going out. 2 students decided that there wasn't enough, that there weren't enough people, and so then they started tracking people in, which then, of course, created great chaos when we tried to clean and sort the data and then to try to make sense of that data, and do we even use that, and what does that tell us versus the out data. They were supposed to be only at one facility. Some students decided that there weren't enough people there, so they either changed facilities without telling us, or in one case it was a facility across the street, so then they started collecting from both facilities. So I mean, it was just all this recoding stuff. And of course, most of it didn't come out until we were, no longer in the field. So.
Right. Yes, I can see how that happened. Yes, my students often like to think that they know best how to modify the project too, and not appreciating the implications of that across the study.
Students also encountered a few issues that I think are worth noting, which was it was very tough for them to be on the street. They were out there during all sorts of weather, usually because they really needed to have relatively, unobstructed view of the people exiting the facility. They couldn't just sit in a car. And then they're kind of standing there on the street hanging out. So one student was kind of asked, are you homeless? Another student was asked by a police officer, basically in a very polite way, whether she was soliciting prostitution. And in many of the cases, or in the cases of most of the hospitals, or many of the hospitals, these poor students were out there in direct visual contact with the refrigerated trucks that they brought in for overflow morgues, which I just can't begin to understand what emotional impact that they would have had, because these people lived in these neighborhoods. It's not like, oh, that's somebody else's neighborhood. So I think it was very, I know there have been some studies with, people going in after earthquakes and being really quite traumatized. And I think there is that risk, which is something we'd really not thought about, because that behavior, New York City hadn't announced that they were bringing in these overflow morgue trucks until we were well into the project.
Mm-hmm. How you talked about having 1,500 hours of log data at, 10 to 20
Sorry,
hours.
I missed, you broke it. Can you say that again?
Yes, you mentioned that you have 1,500 hours of data logged, and it was 10 to 20 hours a week for most of the students most weeks. But I guess in a given data collection, like in a given day, how long would, say, the students stay out there at one time?
It could be as little as an hour and as much as, 5 hours.
Yeah.
I would say most of them were out there for 2 to 3 hours at a time. One of the other problems, and I didn't realize it until I went out to try to collect this laser scan data, is there's nowhere to go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
Most places either were closed or would not let you in.
Mm-hmm.
So, it was an extra burden on our students.
Have you done anything like a debriefing follow-up to talk to the students about just how they're doing or anything like that?
We did about 3 days before their contracts ended with us. We asked them to do another one of these. We would do one of these Zoom things, if not every week, basically 2 out of 3 weeks during the project.
Mm-hmm.
Just to check in, make sure things were going. Also, we were modifying the process in terms of the technology and trying to make sure that we were sending a clear message for the students who were using iPhones, because that's the one we had the problem with. And about half of those students have actually stayed on with us this summer as volunteers to help clean the data and work with us. So we've had some additional feedback through those. And certainly those students seem to be doing okay. Some of them have gone home, wherever that is, to Arizona, to China,
What is or where all, is it all in New York City, or where is the location?
So New York City has 5 boroughs, and we were at least 3 facilities in each of the boroughs, except for Staten Island, where we just could not recruit a student. Again, the students had to live within walking distance of the facility.
Okay. And what's the duration of this project? It sounds like one period has ended, I guess, but you've got the student volunteers going?
Yeah, basically, because we had mobilized this large group and they seemed to be collecting really important data, and this outbreak was so terrible, we basically kept them in the field as long as we could. We basically spent every penny on the project for that. We'd initially asked for, I think, 500 hours for data collection and 1,000 for data cleaning. But we were able to get some funding through another program where we were able to recruit a very qualified master's student. And then we had a lot of inquiries about volunteering. So we kind of changed things, and we used all 1,500 hours out in the field, and then we've used this supplementary funding and the volunteers to clean all the data.
And how long are you expecting this project then to run with the data, until basically you say it's over?
So, we would like to kind of think that our obligation to NSF ends when we've posted the data. So we're very close to that. As I said, we collected this 3D laser scanning through some other funding, and we haven't even started to work with that. And I know some of our students who've been with us this summer have said they would like to continue in the fall. maybe through some type of independent study or some other mechanism. So, I mean, it's a very rich, complicated data set at some, in a time where I think understanding as much of it as possible is really time critical. You know, when we were coming out of the data collection phase, you know, cases were way down in New York. So basically, if you looked at the case distribution and you drew a line across it, you would be at the same height of infection when we started and when we ended, almost exactly. We really kind of caught it. And at this point, it seemed like things were getting under control in the United States. And we thought, oh, well, maybe this data is not so interesting. Maybe nobody's going to care. But now we're at just this horrific point. And I think that a lot of the touching behavior and even just the technique we developed, other people could do at their own hospital facility, where either through CCTV or even just putting somebody outside and just saying, what are people touching? And is there anything we as a medical facility can do to decrease some of these, you know, certainly questionable behaviors?
You have mentioned collaborating with Tom. Are there other collaborators on the project?
No.
Okay, and you met him through the center that you work out of. Okay. And so Converge did not play any role in facilitating that collaboration.
No.
Okay. And then you've talked a lot. So the next question is, what do you anticipate to be or are the primary challenges in conducting this research? And so you've talked a lot about those challenges with keeping the students safe physically and mentally in the field, after the field. Certainly, you've had your own challenges going on. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. So one, we had 2 students originally hired on the project who quit on the first day that we didn't even onboard them yet. I mean, they basically, they applied, I interviewed them, I agreed to hire them, and then within 12 hours they quit. Because either their family or their roommates basically forbade them to do it. So that was an additional difficulty, and you know, they wanted the income. I mean, this was also, you know, for many of these students, this was, I think, a lifeline for them, that, you know, they didn't have funds and they didn't know how long they were going to be, you know, without funds. You know, if they worked at a restaurant tending bar or something, I mean, those kind of jobs just came to an end. So I think most of the students were pretty appreciative of having the funding, and I know NSF liked the idea that we actually employed all these students. There was a high number of minority students, a high number of women, you know, people of color, you know, because we took people from either where they were living or the students who were living there. And then the other thing. The other thing that's been difficult is coordinating the cleaning, because again, we onboarded 13 students, including this master's student, and trying to get them to work together. Very few of them knew each other, and to make sure that things were passed from person to person. So, you know, like we had people check just the data, the file formats, were they correct? And then those got second checked. And then the data files were supposed to be checked. And then they were supposed to be, you know, checked again. And, you know, and just, it was hard to set up these kind of quality control things. And then if something came up, because people were at all different hours and times of the day, that sometimes there was not an immediate response. You know, what do I do with this problem? Because for the summer students, because everything's going to be virtual, we just took students wherever they are. We always have what we call core hours in my lab group for the summer. So everybody works, we'll pick 4 core hours. So 10 to 2, 11 to 3, whatever it is. And then everybody's supposed to be available and working. And then the other hours, either earlier or later in the day, is, you know, maybe they have jobs, maybe they have taken classes, maybe they like to golf, you know, whatever it is. But, you know, so maybe something would come up at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and then it didn't get answered until 11 o'clock the next day, and yet the students then had to work for most of their time. So it was challenging, but they've come together and they've really done a great job, and amazing group of kids. So.
Mm-hmm. You have said one student's a master's student. The other 12, are they all undergrad?
No, we have 4 high school students, and then I think the other 8. See, Sophie is a visiting student from the University of Rochester, so she's an undergrad. I think the other are kind of split half and half. Some of them were master's students in global public health, but some of them are just, other students.
Yeah, okay, so then they're also from different disciplines,
yeah,
and different institutions. Okay, yeah. That's neat. And then now that you're doing the data cleaning, you said many of these are volunteers. I mean, does that kind of add in like another layer to the challenge of like getting them to basically commit to the project?
Yeah, I mean, I think there always is. I think we've worked hard this summer to set up a system to keep them regularly engaged, or to be able to make sure that they communicate back to us if they either can't or don't want to continue. We had one who said she wanted to continue from the spring, but then within a day or two it was clear she was not going to. All the others have continued, at least with some pretty good level of regularity. We have a team meeting for an hour every Tuesday at 1. We have individual meetings where at the beginning I met with every student individually just to try to understand what their interests were, and get them, with other people who wanted to work on that part of the problem. So everybody did data cleaning for 6 weeks, and then now they're kind of getting a chance to get involved in actually doing the analysis. And now I have a kind of small team meeting with each of them every Friday. So if there's 3 of them, they get 40 minutes. If there's 2 of them, they get 30 minutes. And everybody has at least a partner, which I think is hugely helpful in remote working. Usually we only partner the high school students. And then Frank, who's the hired master's student, he's our junior team leader, he's supposed to meet with them at least once a week as well.
Mm-hmm. So. You talked about the students, visually seeing those overflow trucks for the morgue, and that, maybe instilling some trauma. I guess what I was kind of thinking about, if you were talking to with the nature of this research of like documenting and seeing how many things people touch and going in and out of these medical facilities, and so just that, have you personally felt or noticed the students, this maybe wanting to stay at home more, or any of that, really, those observations, I guess, changing their behavior or your behavior? Yeah,
that's very hard I don't think I have enough contact with them to note that. I think also most people in New York live in fairly small apartments. And I think everybody just, starts to get very cabin fever. And certainly if we look at the behavior at a single institution for a single day of the week, you see this rise in touching behavior. Mm-hmm. Now we're trying to disaggregate the data, saying, why do people touch more on this day of the week than that day of the week? Are there different people, at the hospital? Are there different activities happening at the hospital? I have no idea. So we're just really at the beginning of starting to pull apart a lot of this. But you see this kind of noisy general trend of people touching more things as the weeks go on.
Okay, I feel like I want to share. I've got some theories, but you're the expert to myself. So 2 more questions, and we're really coming up on where an hour ago when we got on the call. But much like everyone else, your day-to-day life has been affected as well You talked about getting sick with COVID yourself, having to, work around your kids' schedules. What are some of the changes to your personal life that are impacting your professional life and research, and how have you coped?
The online teaching was incredibly difficult. I teach a census class, and particularly, the last third of the class is basically out in the field. We couldn't do any of that. I was trying to, completely rejig the class on the fly. There seemed to be unending webinars, meetings. And I think there's a huge amount of pressure on faculty to raise money, because all the universities feel that they're going to take this enormous hit on tuition in the fall. And, and while that's going on, there's obviously some downsizing. Anybody who's leaving the university is not being replaced. They've, at least at my university, they've put into play again incentive programs for people to retire, so they're trimming the budgets. And I think because there's so much unknown, how you're going to teach in the fall, what you're going to teach in the fall, who you're going to teach in the fall, it's just this moving target. And it's I think most people can live with unpleasant circumstances. What becomes hardest for people is the uncertainty. And I think faculty are the same. So, we've admitted graduate students from overseas who cannot come, that they're physically not being permitted to come, or they don't want to come, or they're hesitant to come. The university's been trying to come up with ways to accommodate that. And sometimes the messaging from the universities is not so clear.
How have you coped, or how are you coping with this uncertainty in your life too?
I'd say it's very stressful. Yeah. So most people I know have put on weight, and I think in part not only stuck in the house with lots of cookies, but that it's a response to that. So.
The last question is, to date, what have been the consequences, if any, of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations following the killing of George Floyd on you and your research?
Because we had already stopped collecting data in the field, I don't think I'm in a position to comment on that effectively. So.
Okay, that's what I was thinking, the timing that you had said earlier. I think it was like May 18th.
Yeah, it was the last day, and most of the students had actually finished before that. So, whether it has influenced the students and any of their behaviors, interactions, thinking processes, I don't know. Certainly there's been a lot of interest from our summer volunteers on looking at disparity issues. So maybe it has influenced it, that because there's been so much press about how unfair systems are, and how disproportionately impacted so many communities are, that maybe more of the students are interested in looking at some of those issues and trying to really quantify them in a meaningful way and getting that data out to people.
Yeah. Well, that's the last question. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Really, really interesting work, and I think that it will be really valuable, and I can appreciate the challenges that y'all are going through, especially with that data cleaning. So I appreciate it, and I'll be looking to learn from the findings.
Could you do me a favor? And I don't know if it was in your original email, which I still have, so if it's there, you don't need to do anything. But if not, to just send me a note with the full name and award number of this project, because I think NSF wants to understand what connection the Rapids have had to either other Rapids or other projects. And I want to, as I said, I'm going to try to wrap up this project pretty soon, so I want to just go ahead and get my report into them. So.
Okay. I don't think I've sent you that specifically before, so yes, I'll do that after we get off the phone. And yes, so I'll reach out again in the next 12 months, and if there's anything that you'd like to share with me in the meantime, don't hesitate to send it my way.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, and good luck with everything.
You too.
All right,
Bye-bye.
bye.